I'm Jenny.
And I am Benj, and we're here again for another interesting episode as we welcome you all to
the show where we look at the food of the past and the present
to get a glimpse of the plate of the future. Okay, hello mga ka-Future Plate. Naway naging maligaya ang inyong Pasko at advance Happy New Year na rin sa inyo.
Yes, happy holidays, Benj, at syempre sa ating mga listeners. Sana naging supreme ang Pasko nyo.
Naks naman, Supreme. Medyo iba yung naiisip ko pag Supreme. Pizza or yung brand na may red and white logo. Pero anyway, medyo connected naman yan dun sa pag-uusapan natin ngayong gabi. So mas pasusalin lang natin yung term na Supreme. No? It's about sovereignty or food sovereignty.
Oh, wow! Parang ang lalim yan ah. Excited na ako ma-meet ang guest natin who obtained the MA Dissertation Prize for getting the highest score of 97 for the research entitled Freedom from the Corporate Food Regime, Food Sovereignty, and the Struggle for Rice Self-Sufficiency in the Philippines.
Oh, that's a lot to unpack. Mukhang doon pa lang tayo sa food sovereignty makakapag-discuss tonight. Pero mukhang maganda rin yung rice self-sufficiency. So, grabe, another bigatin guest na naman yata with us tonight. I think, aside from food sovereignty, our guest is also interested in food systems inequality, sustainable and environmental conservation, education in development, social entrepreneurship, and inclusive business and leadership and organizational development in impact-driven organizations. Naubusan ako ng hininga doon, Jen.
Iba, achieve na kuya ang mga bagay-bagay. Ayan, so mukhang malawak talaga ang field of expertise ng ating guest for tonight. So wag na nating bitinin ang mga sarili natin at kilalanin na natin ang ating guest na si Mr. Mel Yan, all the way from UK.
Hello, hi everyone. I don't know what time it is in your place, but hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all. And thank you, Benj and Jen, for inviting me here. This will be a very exciting conversation. So I'm a development practitioner in the Philippines. Since I graduated from college, I parang nasa NGO work na ako. So I started sa Ramon Aboitiz Foundation Incorporated. At that time, I was handling youth development. So my background is in education. So I did youth development. But the team kasi that we're handling covers programs on governance. So at some point, I was really doing a lot of training on youth leadership and citizenship, and then eventually it sort of parang nag-evolve na lang siya into trainings for good governance. So we do a lot of work with local government units. And then in 2015, I got crazy and said, "Oh, why do I start my own social enterprise?" Okay, so I jumped into the social entrepreneurship bandwagon. Didn't turn out well. Well, the program was nice and successful, but it's still a business. So I think the business component part, which was handled at that time by a business partner, parang it didn't, hindi siya nag-progress. So in 2015, I started doing consultancy work. So a lot of the work that I was doing were with NGOs, mga former partners namin. Uy, wala ka pala sa Rafi. So pwede ka ba magtrabaho dito? Sabi ko, ano lang. At that time, I was still hopeful sa social enterprise ko. So I said, okay, why not we, do some consultancy work. So I did a lot of work on environment, natural resource management, social enterprise development, and all of that. And then I got the Chevening Scholarship, just like Fatima, in 2019. So I did a master's here in the UK on global development. And at that time, I wanted to pursue much of focusing on education in development, which was my master's, so global development and education. But at some point, I met this person named Jennifer Veloria, who's the founder of Isla Ventures, and they were doing more sustainable food systems initiative in the Philippines. So I met her in the Philippines, we met in London, and then I did internship, all of that. And then I got interested on food systems. So when we were discussing about issues on global inequalities, which is the focus of development studies here in the UK, and then there's a lot of issue on food systems. So that's when it started. So I did my dissertation on food sovereignty and rice self-sufficiency in the Philippines. And then I think they picked it up because they thought it was a good research. Then I got invited to apply for a PhD. So here, yay, I'm now here and doing a PhD in politics and international studies, but my research now is more focused on food sovereignty. And because I'm in the School of Politics and International Studies, so my context of food which is very interesting, I guess. I hope I'm adding a new parang kick into your Future Plate podcast, is that my context on food is food politics. And I hope this would be interesting for you guys, because I know you talk about a lot of food science or talk about a lot of culture and all of that. All of that are important, but I'm gonna specifically focus on the politics of food. So I don't know lang.
Thank you, thank you. So, ito yung main topic natin for tonight. So, what is food sovereignty? So, kumbaga sa konteksto ng Pilipinas, ano yung mga tangible or parang madali intindihin ng Pilipino when it comes to food sovereignty?
All right. So food sovereignty is, I think, kwento ko sa inyo bago tayo nagsimula. It's a very political concept. Ayan na. Kasi sabi ni Jen, minsan, bakit nagli-lead tayo to a political discussion all the way kahit anong topic? Because yeah, you're correct. Everything is political. It's important to know that how you consume, how we produce food is a political exercise. And sometimes we think it's not political kasi parang wala naman ako pakialam. Kumakain lang ako ng burger ko ngayon, di ba? But you eating that burger is probably a product of a political decision. And sometimes a lot of these political decisions, you don't see it right away. And because we talk about political, my concept of political is about power, right? Sino ang may control sa ating food system? So basically, food sovereignty, by the term sovereignty, soberania, right? Meaning we're free individuals, right? Yun yung kaagad pumapasok sa isip natin pag sinabing food sovereignty. So food sovereignty as a concept simply means that countries like the Philippines or communities, if they want to, are able to control their food system. So, ibig sabihin, alam nila or nakokontrol nila kung ano ang ipoproduce na pagkain nila, ano ang gusto nilang kainin na pagkain, at para saan itong pagkain na ito. So, that's basically the concept of food sovereignty. And I guess, ang immediate na tanong siguro dyan, Benj and Jen, is bakit kailangan nilang i-control? Wala ba tayong control sa ating kinakain? No, what do you think? Do you think we have, based on your observation, I'm pretty sure you have had guests and had conversations about this, but sa palagay nyo, do you think wala tayong control sa kinakain natin or sa pinoproduce nating pagkain? So far lang, based on your observation.
Oh, Benj, sagutin mo yan. Bilang ikaw nasa Pilipinas, nararamdaman mo yan dapat.
May quiz pala. Alright. Well, on a personal level, you always have that choice, but that choice is limited by number one, your finances, and the availability of wherever you are geographically. Perhaps that even if, say, you want to eat healthy or eat a certain type of food, probably yung sibuyas ngayon is trending na sa Philippines for being more than 300 a kilo, di ba? And parang may choice kang kumain ng sibuyas kung may pera kang pambili. At the very least, yun yung top of mind ko.
All right. Great. How about you, Jen? Well, bilang nasa Europe ka, do you think you have more control?
Pagka dito, oo. In a way. Although, naramdaman natin yan nung nagka-war, di ba? Affected yung food supply. So, the more na, kasi di ba, ginawang globalize ang supply chain. So, affected lahat, di ba? Pero in terms of, nasa area kasi ako na strong kanilang agriculture, food agriculture na sector. So, may concept sila ng 0 kilometer local food.
Yes. Yeah, and this is very good. No, I think as a take-off point, siguro, the points that you've shared all parang gives us different, the different elements of what food sovereignty is. Number one is that we all have created a food system where what you produce and what you consume is now dependent on whether you can afford it. And the argument of food sovereignty at the core of it is that supposedly adequate food is a right. So ibig sabihin, regardless kung whether may pera ka or wala, anumang kulay mo, anumang gender mo, anumang nasa puso mo, we all have the right to be able to eat adequate food. That's the first thing, right? And then the second is that you talk about, Jen, about global and local, right? And that's precisely what food sovereignty has been fighting for over the years, because a lot of the smallholder farmers, right? And this is not just in the Philippines or tinatawag natin global south, but this is also in the global north. A lot of them in a lot of countries have now been incorporated in exactly what you said, Jen. We are a world market. We are a global system. And I guess I don't want to bore everybody on the history of the globalization. Mapunta tayo sa mga colonialism and imperialism and all of that. But I guess maybe I can start off siguro with the World Trade Organization, because it has been sort of the key parang organization that food sovereignty advocates have been fighting against. That in 1995, when your World Trade Organization was established, part of the process na nangyari is that, okay, let's create common policies for trade globally. Right? So, dapat common, pantay-pantay lahat, right? And that included common policies on trade for agriculture. Una sa lahat, may issue tayo with common policies, no? Kasi alam naman natin hindi pantay-pantay lahat. Right? Common nga yung policy natin, pero hindi naman common yung resources ng mga countries, right? And for some of you who are into colonialism and all of that, alam nyo naman na a lot of the poor countries used to have more resources and all of that. Pero let's probably not go into that space. But I think what happened was that agriculture now became included in the free trade agreement. And to be honest, even if the free trade sort of regime natin, yung pag-create ng world market happened before the World Trade Organization, agriculture used to be a protected industry. So at that time, hindi siya subject to free trade. Ano ibig sabihin? Merong karapatan yung mga countries na magkaroon ng quantitative restrictions sa papasok ng mga imported food sa kanilang country to protect their local farmers. That's number one. Number two is that dahil hindi naman kasali sa free trade and agriculture, that's also because a lot of countries want to make sure that they are able to feed their own people through a self-sufficiency agenda. So yun yung parang naging core noon dati. Now, when the World Trade Organization came in, it actually created multilateral or common policies for trade that included an agreement on agriculture. And that was the issue of the peasant movements at that time back in the 1996 World Food Summit. Kasi sabi nila, hala, ang ibig sabihin yan is that there is now openness in all countries because same na yung trade policies natin. Pwede nang pumasok yung mga imported food without restriction sa bansa natin. And that would mean that because a lot of the imported food are cheaper food, especially grains galing sa global north, that means mamamatay yung ating mga farmers dito, right? And what happened was that a lot of the countries in the global south, nagkaroon ng dumping na tinatawag nila, which means that a lot of the grains that are cheaper from the global north were now dumped into the global south. So a lot of your farmers now have been forced to now sell or produce export crops. Kasi sabi naman nila, eto na yung mga bigas ninyo and all of that, right? Huwag na kayong mag-produce ng mga bigas or staple food. Just focus on producing high-value crops. Palagi natin naririnig yan sa ating Department of Agriculture. Let's just focus on high-value crops. Let's just allow the cheaper imports to come in, right? Ang problema natin dyan, and because you asked about how is this relevant to the Philippines, ang problema natin yan are two things. Number one, on the import side, alam naman natin that imports may be cheap, but they're political. What do I mean by that? Kaya ng countries na nag-e-export to actually just stop exporting at any time. And we have proved that during the pandemic. At some point in early 2020, nung naragpa tayo lahat kung ano ba tong pandemic na to, kailan ba to matatapos, katapusan na ba ng mundo, Vietnam, which supplied 73% of the Philippines' rice imports, suddenly said, wait, I'll stop. Di muna muna ako mag-i-import sa inyo kasi hindi ko alam tong pandemic na to, baka wala na kaming kainin. Pero they have enough supply, ha, to be honest. So that just proves to you that import is not reliable. And there was a research, everyone can look at the state of food security and nutrition in the world. Every year naman yan nire-release ng UN. You can look at specifically the 2019 issue of the state of food security and nutrition, which says, and if I'm not mistaken, ito ay nasa page 62, everyone, which says na every 1% increase of reliance of a country to import can translate to 8% increase in hunger in that particular country. If you get so reliant, and at that time, the UN was like really promoting na, you should move towards self-sufficiency. And ang issue natin dito is that it's a very volatile market. And more often, the volatility is not just about supply and demand. Kasi, syempre volatile kasi it's a supply-demand dynamics. No, we know from that example in Vietnam that I shared to you that markets can be altered by certain decisions of people regardless of the supply and demand. Now, on the side naman, Bench and Jen, ng farmers na ngayon ay forced to do export crops or high-value crops dito kasi nga madami ng cheap na staple food na binagsak dito sa Global South. A lot of the farmers now get subjected also to that volatile price in the global market. So ang ending, minsan profitable ang export crops, minsan hindi. And that actually place a lot of your farmers in debt. So if you look at this deadly combination of your farmers getting incorporated into a global market that's very unstable because they're now forced to produce export crops. Minsan pa talaga hindi pa pumapasa sa global market, no? And then you have imported food coming in your country which is also unstable. Then it's, I think, a good recipe for hunger. And yung thing kasi is that now if your farmers are saying, okay, I'm gonna produce export crops, ibig sabihin itong ginger na to ay ipoproduce ko pang export, right? So ano na lang matitira sa local? You could just imagine how much the cost of that will be in your local market. So that's, I guess, the issue here. And what food sovereignty is saying is that each country or community should be able to grow their own food and feed themselves and be sufficient and be free from that control of the global market. And sometimes some of your big corporations controlling what type of food you should produce and what type of food is available in your country. And sometimes I guess I got to reflect, Bench, yung sinabi mo kanina that, well, it depends on my location. It depends on whether I can afford it or not, right? But at the end of the day, we also forget that one of the things that will help us decide what to eat is also what's available in the market, right? And so if your local food is not available there, syempre, you get to choose na lang the best. Even if you want to be healthy or even if you don't have money, food is not available. That's also another issue that you need to consider. And again, in an import-export economy, it then restricts the type of food that you have, which is very sad because the Philippines used to be referred to as an agricultural country. Are we still are? Ewan ko. Because over the years, parang bumabagsak yata yung investment sa agriculture at ang nag-i-increase naman yung investment sa service industry and manufacturing natin. You can check the World Bank reports on that. But yung problem is that dahil nag-decrease yung ating investments in agriculture and all of that, then a lot of the food that we have, we can say that, they became very expensive. And to be honest, if you look at an FNRI report, which I was referring to, you know that a healthy food in the Philippines is more expensive even than our neighbors in Southeast Asia. So on the average. So ayun lang siguro. So I guess, that's a lot of things that I've shared, guys, but I don't know, maybe you have some questions that you want me to focus on. So ayun.
All right. So, grabe, Mel. No? Wow, that's a lot to unpack. But you nailed it. That it's really an issue of communities and nations, and really it affects us in daily life natin. No? So, I think you've also discussed na rin yung importance niya. So, how about in terms of this concept of food sovereignty? Ano ba yung mga pillars nito? Like, food sovereignty as a concept I know has been well developed, and they have terms and for us to understand this fully. So, can you enlighten us on the pillars of food sovereignty?
All right. Okay. So I guess I'll probably just focus on two pillars, siguro, which should be more relatable to all of us. The first pillar is that food should be first and foremost for nutrition and nourishment and not for trade. That's the very first pillar. So ibig sabihin, you should be able to produce food in your country not because you want to sell the food, but because this is supposed to be intended to feed the community. That's the first one. So it again shifts a lot of mindset on how food should be treated and how the agriculture industry should be treated. And I guess a lot of the implications of that bench siguro means that there should be greater public support or government investment towards agriculture and supporting your farmers rather than government telling your farmers to be competitive. Issue yan ngayon sa Senate. But yeah, telling your farmers to be dapat competitive kayo, dapat marunong kayong magbenta and all of that, right? And even in the national food policy, to be honest, read the National Food Policy 2020 and the introduction says, our aim to make the Philippines secure is that we will have a middle class income so that people will be able to buy adequate food. How can you buy something if it's not present, right? So maybe yan siguro yung tignan natin. So food should be first and foremost for nourishment and nutrition and not for trade. And then this then gives more support to your farmers, right? Na they're able to feed themselves also, right? And be able to control what they produce and for whom. That's one. Second element naman or tenet ng food sovereignty is that it is also an ecological movement. So they're saying that because of the import-export type of production that we have, a lot of the type of agriculture that we're doing now is very industrial. Kasi syempre kung mag-i-export ka, hindi naman pwedeng mag-i-export ka ng 1 kilo, di ba? Dapat thousands of tons, right? And that has forced a lot of your farmers to really go and produce, industrially so that they could produce large quantities of the same type of food. So you're monocropping and all of that. So food sovereignty also, because it wants to make sure that we can feed ourselves. That means we have to protect also our environment. No, because food cannot just be created from thin air. You need land, you need water, you need seeds to be able to grow your food. So, and to do that, we have to protect all these resources. So the second, I guess, very important tenet or pillar of food sovereignty is the ability to be able to protect your farming inputs. And that includes your natural farming inputs, which includes your water, your land, your seed, and all of that. And they have this principles of farming called agroecology, where they look into natural ways of farming. This is kind of different from organic agriculture, although for advocates of organic agriculture, parang broad naman yung perspective nila. But sometimes organic agriculture kasi is still very input intensive. It's just that hindi ka lang gumagamit ng chemicals. Natural lang yung ginagamit mo. But agroecology really follows your traditional agriculture practice of, crop rotation, natural ways of planting to rejuvenate the soil and to take care of your resources and low inputs and all of that. So those are the two sort of key principles of food sovereignty that I could share to everybody, which is very relatable.
Wow, napakalalim. 2 pillars pero napakalalim. Niya, tawag nito, ang dami niyang na-encapsulate na mga
Yes.
That's why naging politika. Anyway, yun nga. So, ano naman yung parang pwedeng ways to increase food sovereignty, especially in the Philippines?
Right. So I guess with the first pillar that I shared with you, that food is first and foremost for nourishment and nutrition, I guess the very first thing is that we need more public investment and support in our local agriculture system. So, and this automatically leads to probably a goal of what we call food self-sufficiency. So, and that's the reason why we want to invest more and give more support to our local farmers, because we want na tayo as Filipinos are able to sustain ourselves, na hindi na tayo magre-rely on imports, because we know that imports, again, as what I shared with you, is a very volatile world market. And, exporters can just say, no, I won't send you any export today. So that's, I guess, one. ensuring that we are self-sufficient. But yung kaakibat naman nito on the other side is that we move towards self-sufficiency, but we have to be mindful of environmental impacts. Because it's possible naman dyan na okay, magsi-self-sufficiency tayo, pero industrial agriculture pa rin, right? But of course, the impacts of that to the environment, and we know the Philippines is one of the top 5 countries that are most vulnerable to climate change impacts. So if we continue the degradation of the environment and we continue to have agriculture practices that destroy the environment, then of course it won't be sustainable also in the end. And you know, a lot of these things I'm sharing with you, I know this is a very big and daunting task, no, na, oh my God, okay, so we want to be self-sufficient, pero at the same time, we need to move towards more sustainable type of production, right? But it's possible, and I'm mindful that it's a transition process that we need to do. Because you asked me, Jen, about ano bang kailangan natin gawin to make that happen. But we know that could take a really long time, and the shift could be a bit painful, but we can start moving towards that. And I'm sharing this with you because the past administration, eto na, political na tayo, the past administration, the Duterte administration, we know naman that was the administration that passed the recently debated impact of the rice tariffication law. So that was the administration that said, okay, we open our countries to imports without quantitative restriction. And gusto ko lang i-note, Jen and Bench, na kahit signatory tayo sa World Trade Organization, the Philippines used to say, okay, we're open to free trade, kasali na yung agriculture except rice. Mahalaga sa amin ang bigas. Kasi may mindset naman tayo sa Philippines, bahala na wala akong ulam, basta meron akong bigas, right? Okay, very simple. Now, we used to say, we will do our best to be rice self-sufficient. Kasi alam natin yung potential impact ng imports nga. But of course, the rice tariffication law junked all of that. All the 30 years of resistance against the World Trade Organization. And by the way, hindi lang tayo almost all countries in Southeast Asia, including the countries where our imports come from, actually are placing quantitative restrictions on the rice. So Southeast Asian countries have been known for that because rice is very important in this side of the world, okay? And alam naman natin, the past administration opened it up with the whole narrative of kailangan ng farmers maging competitive. Kailangan ng rice industry natin na mas, mas maging business and all of that. And it's as if your money can feed you. So that's one. Well, it can, but only to a certain extent. And this administration, no matter what your opinion is about the current administration, but for me, as someone who is looking into food system, at least I am seeing hope a little bit, Jen and Benj, that there was a pronouncement by President Marcos Jr. that the Philippines will move towards self-sufficiency. And I guess there's just one interview which they said na, we cannot rely on imports kasi, at the end of the day, the countries that we source the import from, they'll prioritize their citizen kung ano mang mangyari sa mundo, right? So saan tayo kakain? We have to be self-sufficient. Although, I'm not so clear with how they want to achieve it because it appears lang, so far sa mga nababasa natin na parang industrial agriculture practice pa din yung gagawin. Dahil nga sa time ni Marcos Sr., yun yung Green Revolution. Doon nagsimula ang industrialization ng agriculture ng Pilipinas. And in fairness naman, that's true. During the time of Marcos Sr., totoo yung sinabi ni President Marcos Jr. That we had rice self-sufficiency at that time. That's true. But it's because of industrial agriculture, right? But ngayon, medyo a little bit different na kasi alam naman natin, at least during those time, kahit sira na yung environment, meron pang mga natira. Ngayon, it's the natural resources that we have is really very depleted, plus the threat of climate change pa coming in. So, ayun lang siguro yung parang nakikita ko if I compare the past administration to the current administration. And you can probably parang refer to what I'm talking about. If you read the National Food Policy, pwede nyo naman yang ma-download. Naka-publish naman yan online. This was the National Food Policy 2020. This was past administration pa, makikita nyo dyan yung how they framed how we will achieve food security. Again, through middle-class income so that we can buy food. Of course, I don't know how we will buy something if we won't produce it ourselves. So anyway,
Okay, thank you, Mel. That's really interesting. From my point of view as a teacher, parang napaisip tuloy ako if I should realign some of my students' requirements to also consider the national food policy. Because right now, the food sovereignty is something na medyo new pa na concept for undergraduate students. Although we're moving towards that because we're introducing food integrity and the other like food defense and stuff like that. But anyway, with the things you mentioned regarding how we could increase the sovereignty, can you probably articulate the major challenges for us to achieve this? Kasi levels yun eh. I mean, it's not something na whether, oh, I have attained it or not attained it, but how close am I to this level of sovereignty that would really allow us to maybe have a somewhat more secure future for our plate? Ganon. So yeah, what are the challenges for attaining food sovereignty?
Okay, iniisip ko pa lang yung sasabihin kong challenge, iniisip ko baka maano tayo dito. baka ma-target tayo dito sa sasabihin ko. Challenge number one is because food sovereignty endeavors for food self-sufficiency, right? Kasi nga, magpo-produce ako ng pagkain kasi kakainin ko siya, hindi ko ibebenta. First and foremost. Maya ko na ibenta kung may sobra. Pakainin ko muna yung Pilipinas, okay? Because it's a self-sufficiency agenda, then one challenge niyan, Bench, is our current policies, right? And probably, para hindi siguro tayo maging masyadong controversial, panoorin na lang nila yung debate ni Tulfo at ni Cynthia Villar sa Senate. I highly recommend watching that. And hindi lang watching it because it's fun, but reflecting on what are the arguments being discussed there siguro, di ba? I mean, for your students siguro, Sir Bench, look into and critically examine ano ba yung mga arguments doon, and is Tulfo making sense? Is Cynthia Villar making sense? And all of that. So, una is about the policies, right? Right now, with the rice tarification law, the Philippines is fully open in terms of, you know, really integrating itself in the world food market and all of that. So, and that's one thing that we need to consider about the shift in policy. And I shared with you that the current administration, at least, is looking towards that goal. Right? So that's one challenge. How do you reverse current policies and the discussions that need to happen? Because we can always say, oh, dapat policy ganito. Pero we know that policy making is also a political exercise, di ba? Madaming interest din na kino-consider, right? Kasi hindi lang naman pag nagfo-food policy tayo, we need to look at what's the impact of agriculture to other sectors, right? Including housing and subdivision. So, isa yan. Second is that we need to look into now, another challenge siguro is that we need to look into more sustainable ways of producing. And one issue siguro that I was looking into when I studied food sovereignty is that because of so many years of industrial agriculture, there is a need to regenerate our natural resources, right? And the need to regenerate our natural resources takes time. Plus the fact that we need to also give more education to our farmers in terms of the natural way of production. Kasi meron tayong mga farmers na alam yung natural way of production, pero meron din tayong mga farmers na hindi. And I'm talking here of the need to empower your ordinary farmers. I'm not talking about yung mga farmers na well-educated who is doing a farm here because it's my passion and I have extra money and we have a lupa dito and I support climate change activism. And so eto, nagtatanim ako and you know, all of you follow my example. Tell that to an ordinary farmer, right? So that's another thing about how do we transition towards more sustainable production and how do you ensure na it's really implemented at the grassroots level. That's one. And the third challenge I guess now is really in terms of realigning our funding, no, and the limited budget that we have, granting there's no corruption in between. How do you look into the other needs of the country while at the same time allocating more resources towards that? Because to be honest, the things that I'm telling you, and I'll be the one and the first one to tell you and your listeners, right, that this cannot happen overnight. And at the same time, this also entails a huge amount of resources to shift towards that. And the process of doing that, siguro. And I guess that's the fourth challenge for me now. And the final challenge here, Bench, is the transition process that we need to do. Because you cannot just, you know, reverse everything overnight. And to be honest, a lot of activists and a lot of scholars of food sovereignty, one of my comments always when I study food sovereignty is the lack of discussion on the transition, because transition has to happen. So, and in the transition process needs not just a lot of money, but a lot of learning and unlearning as well from all of us. Even you guys, in terms of what you eat, right? There's a lot of learning and unlearning there. For example, Bench and Jen, when you go to the Philippines, are you ready to give up pandesal? And I'm saying, why do you need to give up pandesal? Do you know we don't produce wheat, right? If you look at all your kakanin and my favorite version of our bread, which is bibingka, they're all made of rice, right? So there's a reason why they're all made of rice, because the Philippines do not produce wheat. So there's a lot of learning and unlearning that needs to happen, if you ask me, among the Filipinos. I mean, look at our Filipino food, right? I mean, I like caldereta. I like, anong tawag nito, your afritada, your menudo. You can't even distinguish what they are. They're all just made of tomato paste and all of that. But number one is that we're not supposed to be growing carrots. That's not natural. May Filipino ba sa carrots? Wala, di ba? It's English. Carrot yung tawag natin, right? Because it's not supposed to grow there, right? And of course, patatas is also not natural in the Philippines, right? That's why they're saying, oh, we shift to sweet potato. But can you imagine your caldereta with a sweet potato? I don't think so, right? So there's a lot of learning and unlearning also for us consumers, that if you want to be self-sufficient, while at the same time ensuring that we have an ecologically produced food and ecologically conscious food system, then we need to look into how also we consume. And we need to look into the local food that we can grow in the Philippines naturally. So yun siguro yung mga kailangan natin i-reflect. Because I just want to, emphasize also to everybody that food sovereignty is not just a farmers movement or taking care of your farmers against the global trade and all of that. It's also about consumers, right? And how we consume all of that. So paano na lang yung Jollibee natin, that a lot of the ingredients there are imported. So yun siguro yung mga i-reflect natin. Kaya it's a transition process that we need to do. So challenge yan for all of us, you, me, all of us. How do we eat? So yeah.
Okay. Well, nangyari naman na yan sa akin na nag-adjust ako ng kinakain dahil, di ba, wala na ako sa Pilipinas. So, walang pandesal dito. Wala silang malambot na tinapay.
Yes.
Tapos yung pagkakanin ko, hindi na 3 times a day. Parang ilang beses na lang sa isang linggo. So, may mga ganon. So, I get the idea of if you need to eat local, talagang ang laking adjustment. Gre-reklamo yung tiyan ko dati, pero magagawa ko. So, last question. Ito. So, having all of this discussion, ang lawak niya, feeling ko magkaka-part 2 tayo, 3 and 4, lahat na. Kasi sangay-sangay siya. Yan. So, how is food sovereignty relevant in securing our future plate?
All right. How is food sovereignty relevant in securing our future plate? I'd like to probably focus siguro Jen and Bench, I guess more probably on the environmental side. Because I guess the political side is very contentious, no? But I'll go to that in a bit. But I guess the very sort of clear principle of food sovereignty is their agri-ecological production. That we cannot produce food and eat food without considering now the impacts to our environment. So with that being said, food sovereignty as a movement that focuses much on sustainably produced food is very crucial for us to ensure that we regenerate, first and foremost, regenerate our planet and the natural means natin to produce food, like water, like your land most especially, which has been acidified due to your use of chemical fertilizers and all of that. So that's one. And second, I guess, is also in terms of eating local, which then reduces your carbon footprint. That's number one, given the climate change impact. And at the same time, also ensuring that then we move towards supporting your local farmers. Because at the end of the day, our future plate can be secured when everybody is able to eat. And that includes your farmers. And the way forward, at least in the food sovereignty perspective, is producing local, because then you use less amount of inputs and less resources, because then you're mindful of ano ba yung appropriate food at the local setting. So the future plate, the future of food for us is local and sustainably produced. And unfortunately, Bench and Jen, I was in the 2021 Food System Summit, and there's not much discussion about that. And even in your COP, they still needed to do another conference on climate change, but impacts on food and all of that. There was a discussion about local. Yes, it's acknowledged, but it appears to be not the way forward, right? It's still about, the world feeding the entire people and all of that. And we know that's not necessarily possible, given that, of course, countries would have to protect themselves. That's number one, right? And that because it's a global and because of the global power imbalance, then there's a lot of protectionism there and a lot of who do I allocate this food for and what can I use this for politically. Yeah, nag-touch na ako sa political side. So local, sustainably produced food, I guess, is for me the way forward.
Okay, thank you, Mel, for that. So we come to the point wherein we summarize our learnings. And for me, yung una kasi pag tinitingnan ko yung concept ng food sovereignty, okay, so the main difference between this and food security is, first of all, you consider where the food comes from. Kasi sa food security, it's as long as it's affordable, regardless kung lahat yan imported or what, secure ka. But here, mas makikita mo na, okay, yun nga yung sovereignty means your control over whatever local means, whether that's regional or national. And of course, on the other hand, there's a need to balance because you cannot completely give up trade or sabihin lang natin, let's just focus on being a net exporter, parang ganun. But you made me realize that, okay, these instabilities are also factors that we need to take into consideration. We cannot be overly dependent, of course, on one country, or even if we're dependent on multiple countries, we don't know what kind of global catastrophe can affect all of them at the same time. But again, of course, there's also the possibility that our country will be affected in such a way that maybe imports will be required at one point in time. But nonetheless, parang overall, you've convinced me at the very least na food self-sufficiency by a nation is still something that we should target, and there are apparently a lot more reasons to do so. And looking at the history of everything, probably things go back to our colonial days talaga na parang neo-colonialism na ba itong nagaganap sa ating trade. But apparently, it roots back to maybe the galleon trade, if not earlier, the pre-Spanish trade era. We won't talk about that now, of course. So, yun lang akin. How about you, Jen? Ano naman yung mga takeaways mo dito?
Naku, saan ba tayo magsisimula? Hindi, kasi ang ganda yung dalawa pa lang na pillars, especially on food and nutrition, and of course yung sa ecology. Bale, para sustainable agriculture practices yung gamitin. Actually, sila din yung dalawang pillars na mini-measure ng Food Sustainability Index. The third one would be food loss and waste na nagkaroon din tayo ng special episode on that. So, makukonect-connect mo na yung concept of sustainability, self-sufficiency, agroecology, nutrition, and everything, magkakaugnay sila, di ba? Pero yung ako, I would ask as many people na tanggapin natin food is political. Kasi for as long as parang sinashove yan, ganyan, parang kung hindi siya political, bakit kailangan natin ng food policies? And ang ganda na tinouch mo yung food policies. Last week lang, may module ako, I'm taking food sustainability course. And we focus on food policies. And ang parang highlight din sa akin dun is, ang hirap daw talaga makahanap ng win-win na food policy. Laging may losers. Parang food policy is a story of winners and losers. Ang hinahanap mo lang ay sino yung una, i-consider mo sino yung pinakatalo. Parang nangyayari kasi sa atin, bakit yung food policies natin ay talo yung farmers? Diba? Parang ganon. So, wag ganon. Wag ganon. So, tsaka panoorin nga nila yung debate kasi bukod sa entertainment, nakakahasa din yun ng utak. Pero napunta din tayo yung word na parang naging favorite word natin to bench all throughout season 1 and now nagbabalik ang word na regenerate, di ba? Kasi hindi lang din talaga sustainability kasi parang sustain mo kung status ko lang, di ba? Pero to regenerate na hindi natin i-abuse and kasi hindi lang naman yung nature, environment yung na-abuse. There are so many things na panalo if we put it at the center. Diba? Ito nga, at part pala dun ay food sovereignty. So, that's it for me.
Alright, so Mel, ano ba yung final message mo to our listeners right now? Just short and sweet. Yeah.
Okay, my short and sweet message is that you need to start reflecting on what you eat. And not just about being conscious about how healthy your food is, but you need to start thinking, where did this food come from?
Mm.
And if you find out where that comes from, then the next thing you need to ask yourselves is that, and I'd like to go back to what Jen said, sa pag-produce ng pagkain ito, para ma-enjoy ko to ngayon, sino ba yung natalo dito? And dapat ba sila yung natalo dito para ma-enjoy ko yung pagkain na to? So, and I hope that gives you a lot of perspectives and insights to think about after listening to this podcast.
Thank you very much, Mel. That's really short pero medyo hindi masyadong matamis kung naka-reflect ka na kasi yung reality is very sad. Okay, with that, thank you again to our listeners. Thank you, Mel, for sharing your valuable time with us. We really learned a lot tonight, today, this afternoon, whatever time it is around the world. And to our viewers, thank you for listening. And again, we bid you goodbye. For more content and to engage with us, like our Facebook page, Future Plate Podcast,
Or join our Facebook group, Future Plate Collective.
and also follow us on Instagram at Future Plate Podcast.
Stay tuned!